they take the cloth off, they set it to the side. And that's what's described in John 20, 5-7, when they arrive at the empty tomb. John and Peter go in, and that's what they see. So the face cloth is set to the side, and then there's also the burial shroud. So Calvin's understanding is that the face cloth would have been around the face in the actual burial, not a separate thing.
Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. And if you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more of these episodes and podcasts. As you all know, I am the author of the book, The Only Witness, which is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. I'm speaking with Doug Powell, and no relation, or at least not a relation that we know of, although my brother's name is Doug Powell, so we're going to get some things maybe confused. But he is a longtime speaker on the Shroud, and he is an author. And let me tell you a little bit more about him. So, and he's done so many different things, he kind of defies easy description. He's a novelist, and he created the Graham Elliott series of biblical archaeological thrillers, a Christian apologist with an M.A. from Biola University. He's authored over a dozen books, contributed to several study Bibles, and speaks widely on faith topics. He's a graduate of the Ateneo Pontificio Regina Apostolorum's Shroud Studies program, and he speaks on the Shroud of Turin. A recording artist, he has also released 8 solo albums and contributed to 2 Alan Parsons records. Wow, that is just an incredible background. Doug, it's so good to have you on today.
Before we continue, I want to briefly tell you about my new book, The Only Witness. It's a work of Christian historical fiction rooted in years of serious research into the Shroud of Turin. The story traces what may have happened to the Shroud across 2,000 years of history through war, secrecy, faith, and survival. It puts you right into the story. If you're interested in the historical mystery behind the Shroud and its possible journey over the last 2 millennia, you can learn more and order your copy at guypowell.com or on Amazon. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. It's always interesting to talk to others that have spent a lot of time studying the Shroud and getting involved in it. Now, you've got some very interesting takes on a couple of different areas as it relates to not only the Shroud but also Christian history, and in particular with John Calvin. So, tell us first of all, who is John Calvin? What was he? Why was he so important? And then how does John Calvin relate to the topic of the Shroud?
Well, first of all, the way I got into this topic isn't because I immediately thought, "Oh, Shroud of Turin, that would be a great tie-in to John Calvin." I kind of came in through the back door, discovered that Calvin had some things to say about the Shroud, and I'm a Calvin admirer. I had no idea he had said anything about the Shroud. I'm a Presbyterian, I'm an elder in the PCA, and I'm a Calvinist, and there's like nobody in the world I would least that I'd rather get into a fight with than John Calvin. There's nobody I would rather not get into a fight with than John Calvin, right? So when I started looking into what he said about the Shroud, I was kind of surprised that there were some obvious ways to answer the objections that he had. And when I was going through the Regina Apostolorum program, I wrote a short paper in the history class that dealt with that. And I very quickly realized there's no way you could squeeze in the answer to Calvin in that short of space. And so that ended up turning into a research proposal for a PhD dissertation, and that's what I'm working on right now. So I'm researching the PhD. It is on Calvin, and so he wrote in 1543. He wrote a book called A Treatise on Relics. So if you're coming out of a non-Reformed or non-Protestant perspective, Calvin is the theologian of the Reformation, essentially. So you have Luther, who kind of starts the fire, but Calvin is the one who systematizes it. And then, so they're kind of like the Beatles and the Stones of the Reformation, and everybody relates back to them one way or the other in the Reformed world, or you're referenced against them, right? They're that important. So, so Calvin is highly intellectual and a very gifted expositor. His theology is highly systematic. Whether you buy it into it or not, it's incredibly well thought through and well organized. And one of the things, he did other writings aside from his systematic theology, which is called the Institutes of Christian Theology. And he had this tract that he put out in 1543. So he lives between 1509 and 1564. So, and he's mainly known for living in Geneva, although he's from France. So from 1543 until his death, he's in Geneva, and he writes this book in 1543, which is against relics. And within that, he goes hard against relics in general, and then he singles some things out. And one of the things he singles out is the Shroud of Turin, but it's not in Turin at that time. It's mainly associated with Chambéry, France, which is where the King of Savoy's capital was on the west side of the Alps. He had one on the east side of the Alps as well. But during Calvin's lifetime, it interestingly was not in Chambéry, France. So that Chambéry is, it's not very far. Today you could drive it in like an hour and a half from Geneva to Chambéry. So it was definitely within his ability to have gone to Chambéry and seen it if it was in Chambéry, but it was really on the other side of the Alps for most of that time because there was a lot of instability in the area. So for most of Calvin's time, only in the last couple of years of his life was it actually in Chambéry. So so he goes after it pretty hard, and he describes it, and he goes after it in several different ways. So he goes after the history of it and where it's been, because it just kind of shows up out of nowhere. And the oldest universally accepted date is around 1355 in Léry, France. So it shows up about 200 years before Calvin is around. And so he says, we don't know where it was before that. At that time, there are a number of other shrouds that are claimed to be held in other different places. And so he thinks that casts doubt on it. He says that if there had been an actual image on the shroud, then the Gospels would have mentioned it, because that's a pretty big deal. He says that image is painted. It's a forgery. It's painted, because if you lived in 1543, you wouldn't have any concept of how an image could exist in any other way than painting it or carving it or whatever. So he calls it a painting. He says the legend of Abgar, which has an impression of at least Jesus's face, sometimes his body on the cloth, is a fairy tale. That's what he calls it. He says that having an image at all violates the second commandment. And he says that the image, just the shroud itself, is not consistent with Jewish burial practices. And then the last thing, the overarching thing, is that he rejects all relics because they encourage idolatry. So, as somebody who is as well versed in the shroud as you are, as I ran through the list, I know that you immediately were going, yeah, but we know this and this and this and this, and you could answer them on every single one of those things, with the knowledge that we have now. with the exception of the last one, which is his take on relics. So that's, you could still answer him, but that you could have answered him then on that. So, but given what we know now about the historical work that's been done on the shroud and the scientific evidence that's been amassed on the shroud, that there are a ton of different ways to answer Calvin. So the question is, so the dissertation is presenting all this stuff against Calvin's arguments. And then really the question is, if Calvin knew what we knew now, what would he do with that? Would he accept it or not? And so that's what I've been working on.
Yeah, very interesting. One thing I had on Dan Clausen one or two interviews ago, and he had an interesting take on forgeries. And the take was that why would anyone want to make a forgery? Well, the reason why they would want to make a forgery is that they'd want to make money off of it or get influence or power or whatever it was. And so if there were no other shrouds out there, and let's say in 1350 when it kind of first appeared to the West, although there's definitely documented evidence that it existed or it could have existed earlier, um, then why would someone make a shroud? And to Calvin's point as well, is why would they put an image on the cloth as opposed to just the blood on the cloth? Because the image is not mentioned anywhere in the Gospels. And it's maybe only, hinted at, in Paul 3:1 and maybe a couple of other places. But in essence, there's no image. So if I wanted to make a forgery, logically thinking through this, if I wanted to make a forgery in 1350 that somebody later on would want to see it and say, well, that's a forgery. It's got a picture on it. It's got an image on it. Why would I make it with an image on it? The value would have been to not have the image on it. And so it's kind of interesting, in the 1500s, that even for him to say, well, it's a forgery, it has an image on it. Well, where did the idea, if it was truly a forgery, where did the idea of putting an image on it come from? Because it didn't come from the Gospels.
Right. So it's an excellent point. And if you were going to do it, if you're going to make a forgery, then in order to get the blood on the right places on the body, you would just, intuitively you'd paint the body onto the cloth first and then paint the blood on top of it. But the Stirp examination found that the blood is, the image does not go underneath the blood. So that means the blood would go down first and then you paint the body around it. That's how you'd have to do it, which is really counterintuitive. The other thing is, as you know, what has made this shroud so famous in the 20th century is that it has so many properties of the negative image of a photograph. So that would mean that the artist, if it was a forgery, would essentially try to imitate in most ways the negative image of a body. But this is 400, 500 years before the invention of photography. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever why they would do that. And then when you see, so one of the things that I'm trying to answer is, what did Calvin know? Because I can't place him historically in the same location of the shroud. And the shroud was on the move a lot during Calvin's lifetime. Like I said, for most of the time he's in Geneva. It's on the other side of the Alps over in Italy, but not in Turin at this point. I think it's Vercelli. And so it's over there. And so he probably never saw it in person. So if he didn't see it in person, where is he getting his information and what quality is that information? So there are, he had to get it secondhand, maybe even third hand, or maybe he saw a copy. So one of the things I was looking into is how many copies existed during Calvin's lifetime. And at least the ones that we know of, there are 4 confirmed ones. And once you see them, you'll see they are so unlike the actual shroud itself. You would never take them, you would never mistake them. So we've got the most current picture of the shroud, the scan from about 20 years ago on the right, and then the four existing shrouds that still exist today, and the dates that were around during Calvin's time. And so you can see that they don't they're not meant to be forgeries in the sense that they're trying to fool people. It's not like they're trying to be deceptive. They're more meant for devotional purposes, and that's a good point. Marinelli, yes, I'm sorry. So I got her first name and her last name all confused. Yeah. She helpfully points out. So clearly these are for devotional purposes, and more than trying to be deceptive. They all are the Leary one from 1516 is a 1/3 size, so clearly that's not meant to deceive anybody. The other three are full size and front and back. The most famous competitor to the shroud would have been the Shroud of Byzantium, but that gets destroyed in the French Revolution. But that's a front and back one too, and the copies, the existing depictions of the Shroud of Byzantium that we have are even more stylized than this, if they're accurate. So clearly you wouldn't ever confuse this with the actual shroud. And what I've cut off here, and what you can kind of see on the Lear shroud, is that a lot of times they are dated and they have some inscription on it that says they're copies that you couldn't be confused by. And so that makes it harder to be deceived. When we think of forgery, we're thinking deception. These wouldn't be forgeries. And if you've never come across the copies of the shroud before, the reason they were made was, again, like Marinelli said, probably for devotional purposes, and they were most of the time laid on the actual shroud as a way of kind of sanctifying them. And within the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox mindsets, the touching of something to an authentic relic makes it a third-class relic or a secondary kind of a relic. I think the class distinctions were updated recently by the Vatican. So there's only two classes. There's not really a third-class relic anymore. And the Orthodox never had a formal thing, but they kind of think of it like that too. So technically, the four copies would be authentic relics, third-class relics, because they had been touched to the shroud. And so a lot of these distinctions get lost in Protestant world, and probably on Calvin as well. And then in addition to that, here are four different paintings that existed during Calvin's time. And they actually do better than the copies, in the sense of really depicting what's there, except that you've got a fresco and an illumination. The one on the left is from an illumination from a book. The next one from the 1530s is a fresco on the side of a building in Italy. Then you've got two other paintings after that. So they're clearly not trying to fool you into thinking that they're the shroud. And then the other thing that Calvin may have been aware of is we've got a medallion that pre-existed about 200 years before Calvin, and we've got a mold for a variation of that medallion, and then there are two other medallions from about 100 years before Calvin. So if he had some sort of visual experience with the shroud, it would be something like that. And you can see why, if that's what you're basing your information on the shroud of, you would just call it a painting. And a forgery. And because he's got this understanding of images that is from a very narrow reading of the second commandment, then the image couldn't possibly be legit. And he doesn't like relics anyway. So.
Right. Well, so he had, it sounds like he had a handful of different types of objections, like, historical, and it didn't exist, I guess, before the 1350s, and then this artistic reference that he had where he may not have ever seen it personally, only heard about it or saw it as a secondary, or I guess a tertiary, or whatever that scale is of and class of relics are. And then there was something as well about the Jewish burial practices. Tell us a little bit more about, especially the Jewish burial practices.
Well, he says it doesn't correspond with the Jewish burial practices as they do it currently in his time, or the ancient records of it. And this is an interesting claim because, of course, he would have access to like the Mishnah and the ceremonial laws and things like that. But the Jews were kicked out of France before Calvin was born and were not allowed back in until after he died. And the same is true of Geneva. He lived for about 2.5 years in Strasbourg, and the Jews were allowed in certain ghettos in Strasbourg, and they could travel through there on business. So that would be his main firsthand experience with Jews, and I doubt that his main interest at the time was their burial practice. I bet he was more interested in theological disputes than do you wrap the sheet over the head or just over the shoulders? Because what he seems to think is that the burial shroud it goes over the shoulders and it encloses the body, and then the sudarium or the headcloth is what is placed on the head, and it's simultaneous. So, my understanding from the evidence that we have, and my main the thesis I did in the Ateneo Apostolorum, the Regina Apostolorum program, was on the Sudarium of Oviedo as the face cloth of Jesus. That's separated when Jesus is placed in the tomb. So for those unfamiliar with that, there would have been a cloth placed around Jesus's head when he died on the cross. Placing the cross over the face before the body gets to the tomb is the same thing as like pulling a sheet over the face that we do nowadays. So they would have done that. Plus, it had the benefit of catching the blood from the body. And in the Jewish tradition, the soul is in the blood, and so you got, if a Jew dies violently or bleeds when they are dying, that blood has to be buried with the body because that's part of where the soul is. And so that's true to this day. They bury the blood with the body. So if it's on the clothes or on the dirt on the ground or whatever, it gets buried with the body. So because of the cloth on the face, when they move Jesus to the tomb, they take the cloth off, they set it to the side. And that's what's described in John 20:5-7. When they arrive at the empty tomb, John and Peter go in, and that's what they see. So the face cloth is set to the side, and then there's also the burial shroud. So Calvin's understanding is that the face cloth would have been around the face in the actual burial, not a separate thing. So not a separate stage. And you see that depicted in some medieval icons and things like that. So when you read the sources in the Mishnah, there's no indication that how Calvin is picturing it is how it was done. On the other hand, there's no lockdown step-by-step process for exactly how it is done. Archaeologically, so with no Jews in where he lived during his lifetime, it's not like he's going to Jewish funerals and seeing how this is done, right? So there's some sort of, he's operating from a lack of knowledge here, essentially, or a unlimited amount of knowledge that doesn't account for everything. So what we know now is that in France, archaeologically, there are no existing Jewish cemeteries. So not that are extant. They've been like bulldozed over and turned into fields, or they don't still remain. So there's only one of those that has actually been excavated, and it is from around the time of Calvin. And so that's our only archaeological evidence from the time of Calvin. And then there is an excellent study by, I think her name is Rachel Halaki. I can't remember exactly how you say her last name. On the Jewish burials in Israel, and so there are about 1,000 tombs that have been discovered around Jerusalem, and the Jerusalem ones are similar to the Jericho ones, and that's where you see burial shrouds in the way that we envision how Jesus is buried in Jerusalem. And that style of tomb, that is the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre, there's about 100 of those, the Acrostileum style tomb. And so how we picture the Shroud of Turin and Jesus' body being put into it is consistent with all of that, although there's no hard and fast rule that says it has to be this way every single time, right? So there are certain regulations that have to be that way, but there's nothing that says you're going to wrap it around the shoulders and then you're going to do the face cloth separately. There's nothing that says that. It may have been done that way sometimes. It may have been done that way to Calvin's knowledge, but it's only partial knowledge, and it's very, very limited what he had access to. So what we really see is there not only is there a variety of ways that the bodies could be buried and the bodies could be prepared, but it's more consistent with how we are arguing for how Jesus was buried in the shroud than it is what Calvin was arguing. Another thing that might have influenced Calvin in terms of this not being authentic with Jewish burial practices, and we don't know for sure because he doesn't say so, but the Jewish burial practices prescribe the position of the arms, the way they should be. And so for the most part, they are straight at the sides of the body, but other times they're crossed over the groins. And by Calvin's time, they were also going over the heart like that. So there are a variety of positions. So if Calvin thought that the arms were straight, which is how most people thought it was at the time, then if you look at the position of the arms on the shroud, it wouldn't be authentic. But now we know, based on the archaeological evidence found in France at the one cemetery that's been excavated, that was in fact one of the ways in which Jews buried. So he clearly didn't have accurate or complete knowledge, or even close to complete knowledge. And so that argument is one of his weakest ones, given what we know now.
Well, and to that, it is even, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe longer. In order to research something, you might go to a physical library, you might be able to find the book online, and depending, if you wanted to pay for it, you could buy it through Amazon or whatever, or you go to the library, hopefully you can find it, or hopefully, because I've been suffering through this as I've been doing my research, you get it on the interlibrary loan system or whatever. Well, but when you think about two things as you were talking, is if he's in Geneva, and as you said, there are no Jews in Geneva. They've all been kicked out, and they've been kicked out of France. Then there would be no books there for him to physically reference to find out how, to even be able to read the Mishnah. So, and I don't know how big the Mishnah is, but copies of books back then were very expensive. If you had a book, it was like a life salary for a middle class person, because not only did it take a whole farm of sheep or calves to be able to get the vellum, but then you had to have somebody actually manually scribe it and potentially illustrate it with some really good stuff. And so he may not have even had access to it. So again, he was not looking at firsthand written knowledge. He was probably looking at secondhand or thirdhand of a Christian, or maybe an atheist, but probably a Christian, who had talked to a Jew that was from somewhere else, maybe Strasbourg or some other city where the Jews were, so he would have heard about it. And so again, not only was his knowledge limited for other reasons, but his knowledge was limited simply because you didn't have the internet and libraries to go off and find these books that might describe the burial practices.
Well, that's true. It's a great point. There is evidence when he was in Strasbourg, one of his good friends there had good relationships with one of the influential rabbis at the time. And Calvin may have had a direct line of contact with him at the time or later, or at least had a way in to him. So it's not like he was completely divorced from communication with Jewish scholars.
Okay. Okay.
So he may have had, we just don't know, because he never wrote about it. But we do know one of his close friends did have close contact with these Jewish scholars. As far as the way you would even do that kind of research, Calvin was no slouch intellectually. You got to figure he wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion. He wrote without any versification, right? So at that time, the Reformation had not gotten to the point where they introduced verses into the Bible. So try to find all the cross references in your Bible around any particular doctrine and collect them all together in order to be able to express it systematically. That's something.
Yeah,
So
no,
he was pretty gifted.
yeah, well, you're so right. I don't remember when chapters and verse were invented, because, like you were saying, at that point they just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and there was no breaks, and I don't even know if there were commas at the time, and then to actually add verses was, it's so interesting when you think of historically, how far simple things like just putting a verse number on a sentence in the Bible so that we can identify it and talk about it. And yet that didn't exist at some point in history. And and I don't know, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but did you know that the number zero had to be invented? I mean, we could count, counting has been around a long time, but there was never a number zero and
Yeah,
for
right.
centuries and millennia, and somebody
Yeah,
had to invent the number zero. So we have no idea, how hard it was for scholars like Calvin and leaders like Calvin to be able to to do things like that.
yeah.
um now
Arabic philosophers, I think, came up with that one.
I think it was Indians. I think it was the
Yeah,
Indians that did, but I could be wrong, but I think it was the Indians.
we'll
But
let them
anyway,
fight it out.
yeah, that's right. That is exactly right. It's funny too, though. One of the things that and so my book, and you've written a bunch of books as well. But as I was researching, my book, which spans over 2 millennia, so I had to understand what life was like in different periods of time. And one of the things that's kind of fascinating is with Calvin and those time periods was that the Catholic churches were put together and they had stained glass windows, and the stained glass windows were there. And I don't know exactly the timing, but stained glass windows have definitely been around since the 1100s. And but the stained glass windows were there to be able to teach the stories of the Bible to the illiterate so that they would be able to understand what the sermons were about and be able to then see them and remember them. And one of the things that I have trouble with Calvin is he wanted to remove all of the images out of the churches. And so he wanted to have, whitewashed walls, and he wanted to have no images, no paintings. And I don't believe, as I remember, I don't think he wanted to have even stained glass windows. And so from that perspective, okay, he was following the second commandment, I guess. But on the other hand, he wasn't allowing the illiterate to learn, more stories about Christ and the life of Jesus. And I don't know, any thoughts on that or?
Yeah, by the time Calvin got to Geneva, there were no images. So he did not have them removed. That precedes him. And his writing against images in the church is really against them in worship, use in worship. He's okay with how you describe it in terms of educating the illiterate and things like that. It's people following Luther and Calvin who then take it way further and to a violent extent in many ways. Calvin wasn't one of those. Calvinists may have been, they were. but Calvin himself was not. So his objection is what you're talking about. It's against the second commandment, but he's against them for use in worship for a few reasons. The main one is that so he famously writes in the Institutes that the human heart is an idol factory. And so you can turn anything into an idol. And of course, any Christian could tell you that's absolutely true. You can abuse anything, any good thing God makes, you can turn into an idol. So Calvin's spot on right there. But he thinks that relics and images particularly encourage idolatry. And so when he's writing against images and relics, his main concern is as a pastor more than as a systematic theologian. So he's trying to protect people the laity who are more susceptible to superstitions from having those superstitions preyed on or abused, or they give into their worst instincts or something like that. So you can see a pastor's heart behind it. He's not like some cold-hearted robot. But I think he's misguided at the same time, because you can't get rid of anything that you can turn into an idol, or you'd have to get rid of everything, including yourself. So I think that it's way overboard there. And so his concern is that you worship an invisible, infinite God without images. He revealed himself in his word, and therefore you worship him in word. And really the only legitimate images in worship are the sacraments. So the bread and the wine of the Eucharist are acceptable. And other than that, everything else should be out of bounds, because if God really is the self-existent creator of all things outside of himself, who is totally unlimited except in what his character is. Okay, he's only limited by his character, so that's why he can't lie or he can't contradict himself, right? So there are things that God can't do, but they have to do with his character, not his ability. So if you were trying to depict that God, then as soon as you touched a brush to a canvas, you have limited God. You have turned the infinite God finite. You have turned the invisible God physical. And and that diminishes God. And so that's his problem with it. However, he doesn't seem to appreciate, I guess he doesn't really have like a philosophy of language or anything like that, but all language is representational if it actually represents the way reality is. And so it's just a visual representation instead of a verbal one. Now, God revealed himself in his word. And so that's why Calvin is so committed to that. The Roman Catholic and Orthodox answer to that, it comes from the Seventh Council, which is Nicaea too. So the Seventh Ecumenical Council reestablishes images after a time of iconoclasm, and the way it justifies it is based on the Fourth Council. So the Fourth Council of Chalcedon is where we get the creed or definition that expresses that Jesus was fully human and he was fully divine in one person, the hypostatic union. It's a mystery. How does that work? No idea. There's no analogy for it. But that is Orthodox lowercase o teaching. That is the basis of all Orthodox Christianity. It's something that that Protestants and Roman Catholics and Orthodox all affirm. And so this doctrine of the incarnation is then exemplified in images, in icons. And so this is just as Jesus is a physical, manifest representation in the world of the invisible, eternal, infinite God. The images are physical depictions of him that are windows into that eternal, invisible truth. They are incarnational, and especially in Eastern Orthodoxy, it is very, very heavily, it emphasizes the incarnation in everything that it does. So if you go into an Eastern Orthodox church or a service, then it's not just icons that are there. You've got the incense going on, the architecture all around you, the way it sounds is different. It engages every single one of your senses because it is so heavily focused on the incarnation and trying to just convey that. And at the same time, use these physical sensations to remind you of the eternal reality of God. And that's what icons do. And so that's what gets affirmed at the Seventh Council. That's the justification when you read about it, catechism today. It's based on the incarnation. So that is something that Calvin, I'm not sure if he appreciated or not. What he seems to just stop at the physical object itself. And then he also doesn't buy into the distinction that both Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholicism make, which is there's a difference between veneration and adoration. So in adoration, that is reserved for God alone. That is worship. Veneration is honoring something. And so when God, if it is an icon of of a person other than Jesus, then it is you can honor that person or the work that God did through the vessel of that person. You're not ascribing any sort of worship to that person. And in fact, that's why Eastern Orthodox icons are flat and non-representational. You can never use an Orthodox icon like a police lineup and go out and find, the actual John the Baptist based on what you're looking at on the icon. It's not supposed to be that way because they don't want you to confuse the person with the fact that this was merely the vessel through which God did his work to establish the kingdom. And so of those distinctions get lost on Calvin. He thinks those are word games that are being played and that you end up with worship either way around. And there's no doubt that there are people who would be kind of uninformed or superstitious lay people who would confuse it and worship the images. Yes, but that's not what their intention was. That just means they misunderstand it. And so you don't want to judge the practice by its abuses. You want to judge it by its intended use. And I think he misses that.
Just to make sure, and I'm just, as you were talking, I had a million thoughts, and hopefully I can remember a couple of them. But one of them is you said that, if you have an invisible God and an omnipotent and all powerful and what have you, and you try and make an image of that God, and as soon as you put paint, to canvas, that you're going to now limit you're going to now put a limit to what that God is and that representation is. Well, isn't that the same thing with the written word and even the spoken word? Because if I were to, say, what is God? Well, he's the omnipotent. He's all the omnis, right? He's omni everything. He's omni.
Omni.
So even in the spoken word, by the way we just try and describe it, we are now limiting what God is. And so where was that kind of how Calvin would interpret that, or is that incorrect? Or
Well, I think Calvin would agree that when God reveals himself in his word, he is condescending to us, but he's revealing himself what he wants us to know for salvation. Okay, the Bible isn't an exhaustive compendium of knowledge. It is what we need to know about God for our salvation. That's why it's not a science book or something like that. So he has that. He's fully on board with that. What he doesn't appreciate is that the same could be said for images. And in fact, it's interesting that in Orthodoxy, they make a point to that there are no painters of icons. Icons aren't painted; they're written.
Mm-hmm.
So there's prayers being offered throughout the production of an icon, and they are physically depicting the word. But it is the word that is the focus, and that's why icons are written and not painted.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, thank you for
Another
that.
distinction that Calvin doesn't have, that Orthodoxy makes an interesting distinction of, and I think this probably ports over to Catholicism as well. But when I was researching one of my novels, it had to do with it was mainly focused on Eastern Orthodoxy. So there's a place in Greece called Mount Athos. And are you familiar with Mount Athos?
Yeah, only from writing, yes. Uh-huh.
Okay. So for those who don't know, it's a peninsula that is the northeast corner of Greece. There's like three fingers sticking out into the sea there, and the far eastern one is Mount Athos. So it looks like a little Florida. There's like three little Floridas there, and it's the one on the right. And it goes out into the sea for about 40 miles, and there's a wall that cuts it off from the mainland, a literal wall, and it's been cut off from the mainland for 1,100 years officially, and longer if you count the time prior to that. And the only thing allowed on the peninsula, the only thing that's there, are 20 different Orthodox monasteries. That's it. There's one little administrative town made out of monks from the monasteries, but otherwise it's just monasteries and monks that are associated with the monasteries that live outside the monasteries, either in their own little communities or even alone. And it is considered the most holy place in Orthodoxy because of this concentration of monks. And so it's completely autonomous. It's officially part of Greece, but really it's run by the Patriarchate of Constantinople. No women have been allowed on Athos for over 1,000 years, and you can't visit it. There are no visitors. They do allow 110 Orthodox men, pilgrims a day to visit for 3 nights, and they allow 10 non-Orthodox. And I was able to sneak under there. They actually, I don't know what was wrong with their vetting process, but they allowed a Presbyterian to get on there. And so I went with a buddy of mine who's an Orthodox priest. And so one of the things, I visited 10 of the monasteries. And one of the things you do is when you get to a monastery is they take you into the Catholicon or the cathedral, and that you venerate the icons. If you're Orthodox, I did not venerate the icons, but I observed. And then on the altar, from underneath the altar, they pull out the different relics and they explain to you what the relics are. And so one of the first ones I saw was they pulled out this case. It was like this sphere type of case, and they had a window and they opened it up, and it was a skull on the inside, and they explained that it was the skull of Fotini. And I said, who is Fotini? I don't know Fotini. And they said, Fotini is the name of the Samaritan woman at the well. And this is her skull. And so the Orthodox guys I was with, they venerated the skull of Fotini. And the guy I was with, he is a good friend, and he was totally open for all of my questions. And so later I said, how do they know that's this? I mean, how do they know the Samaritan woman's name was Fotini, number one? Number two, how do they know that would be her skull? And he said, that's the wrong question. Do you believe that there was a woman at the well? And I said, Absolutely. He said, like, real historical figure. And I said, absolutely. And he said, that's what you're honoring.
Mm.
But I said, but how would they know? And he said, well, it doesn't matter because you're honoring the thing that actually existed. However, the tradition is that this goes back farther than any other tradition, that this is the skull. So if you ask, is it authentic? They'll say yes. And if you say, how do you know? They'll say, it doesn't matter. It was a real person. And so whichever one you're focusing on, they kind of like focused on the other one, because for a Protestant, we see the veneration of this skull and we think, well, that kind of looks like, they're worshiping the wrong thing. But when we say, how do you know? They hear this kind of Western scientific interest that misses the meaning of it. And therefore, we're the idolaters, right? Because we're focusing on the wrong thing. So we both commit the same crime from different perspectives. And it was a really eye-opening kind of conversation to have.
Wow, and to go to Mount Athos and be a part of it, that's what an experience. I do have one last question for you, and that is, so if the shroud, if I don't know how to, I don't know what level to go at, but let's say if the shroud was seen by Calvin and he said, wow, that looks like it's really could be the image from the resurrection and from the tomb. Um, what do you think that would have done to his certainly his view on icons in the church, and then just generally on his views of the of all of these relics?
Well, okay, so my interest in Calvin, the way I would answer that is I don't know enough about him, his personal life and history, to be able to speak with any real authority. So I'm just ballparking. I'm like focusing on what he knew at this time. I mean, I admire him probably more than any other non-biblical theologian, and so I'm heavily influenced by the just a light go out. Sorry about that. By the institutes and his commentaries and other writings, but it's not like I'm obsessed with Calvin and know every single thing about him. So personality wise, how we might respond to that, I'm just guessing. Okay. But I do know that when he wrote that book in 1543, that was the year Copernicus died. And then when Calvin died in 1564, that's the year that Galileo was born. So, we talk a lot about, or not, sometimes we talk about how Luther is the last medieval man, but Calvin he's still pre-scientific. He doesn't have a scientific category. That's why it's so easy to come up with all the things that we probably both did. When you hear all of his objections, you can go, there's so much he doesn't know scientifically. So it's completely anachronistic to say, okay, if he stood in front of the shroud, what would he have thought? Because what we think he might think is probably not it, because we can't even imagine what a pre-scientific mindset is like. But if he saw it in person, was able to get up close as much as you and I ever dreamed of doing, and had time to just stare at it like the Sturp guys did or something like that, my guess is he would be perplexed, and he would think of it in a unique way. This is not like any other relic out there. This has something really weird about it. I would think he would at least come to that conclusion, that this is not like the other things. I think you could get him that far. But given that, okay, here's the weirdest thing about all his objections. So he's got these 8 objections, and you got 7 of them that, with historical evidence and scientific evidence, we can think of lots of different ways to answer him. But then you've got the question of idolatry. He's trying to preserve people from, protect them from their idolatry. That's like a mindset that's not going to be answered by his direct encounter with the shroud. And what's weird is that's his big issue. It's going to encourage idolatry. But then he gives all these reasons that support that, his argument that it's not authentic. And you can answer all of those, but it still doesn't answer his main issue. And given that, if he stood in front of the shroud and saw what you and I saw, even if he had our knowledge and saw what we saw, he may not back off the trying to protect people from idolatry thing.
Yeah.
So that's about as good as I can give you.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, I'd love to keep going, and maybe we'll have to do this in a second round. But Doug, it's been phenomenal and very interesting to, understand the shroud in the eyes of, somebody not from, kind of like you called it, the scientific era, and then of course somebody as powerful and as important as John Calvin. It's very, very interesting. And so now you said you were writing a dissertation. What was the topic of the dissertation?
It is answering John Calvin, his polemic. Let's see. You want to hear the super cool title? If I can find it.
Yeah.
All right. Here's what we got: the historical and theological evidence for the Shroud of Turin: a critical response to John Calvin's polemic.
Yeah, very interesting. All right, very good. That's fantastic.
I'm
And
still shopping the movie rights to that one.
very good. Well, hopefully you'll get a somebody to invest in it. That'd be fantastic. Certainly for the Presbyterians, I guess, and then
Yeah.
maybe us Methodists as well, as we can kind of glom on and find out what and try and understand what those Presbyterians are thinking.
Yeah. Well, I may get barred from the table. I may come over to Methodism here if I get kicked out. So
Yeah, please, you're welcome. Fantastic. Well, Doug, thank you again so much. And where can folks learn more about you and find out more about your books? It sounds like you've got some really, really cool books out there, the Graham Elliott series. Tell us just a couple of words about that before we close.
Well, those are biblical archaeological thrillers. There are 4 of them out right now. The 5th one, this is the one on Mount Athos, isn't out yet, but it focuses on, do you know anything about Daniel Wallace? You ever heard of Daniel Wallace?
Maybe, probably not.
He's a Greek New Testament scholar, and he goes about 25 years ago. He started the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and he started going all over the world with a document scanner and scanning all original language New Testament manuscripts that he could find. So there are over 5,000 of them. And so there's several million pages to scan. And the idea is that the more scholars you can get to have access to the most number of resources, the more fine-tuned more confidence you can have that the text that we have is uncorrupted, that we've recovered the original text. So Daniel Wallace goes all over the world doing these scans, and they're in monasteries and private collections and museums and things like that. And when you hear him talk about what he has to do and the things that he's gone through in order to do this work and the things that he's discovered doing this work, it is absolutely fascinating. And so I asked him if I could steal his life to some degree and base a character on that, who then kind of gets into different other misadventures. And he graciously said that was okay. So it's only loosely based on that. But that's what my protagonist does. He goes around with the document scanner doing all of that. But in the course of that, he ends up getting drawn into different archaeological investigations that all have to do with real things. So the books are about 95% real. Everything you read about them, all the finds and all the things that went behind them and all that, it's all real. And so I combined that with each one kind of has a different thing that it's chasing after, but one of them is the Shroud of Turin, actually. So I've got one book, let's see, The Invisible Thread is where you have the Sudarium of Oviedo and the Shroud. So in my case, my protagonist has to photograph both of them because the same resolution and the same quality of both cloths has never been done, and since they're never going to be in the same place, you need photographs in order to best compare them if they really are connected. And so he kind of gets wrangled into doing a secret investigation for that. And I will tell you that movie right has been sold, and there is a script being worked on for that one right now. So fingers
Wow,
crossed.
congratulations.
I've
Yeah.
never been in the movie world before, so we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, well, that'll be fascinating. So that's well, let us know when it comes out. We'll be looking forward to it. And
Me
it seems
too.
like, yeah, yeah, it seems like generally the interest in the Shroud has certainly accelerated over the last few years, and so then now there's a couple of movies coming out. There was a documentary that was being put together on the Shroud as we were in St. Louis at the recent conference, and then there's Mel Gibson's doing another one, I think it is, on the Passion, and then yours. Hopefully, it'll come out, and so we'll be praying for it to come out. It sounds like it should be a lot of fun.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. I'll keep you posted.
Absolutely. Well, Doug, thank you again for being on, and otherwise for the audience, please stay tuned for many other videos in this series on the backstory of the Shroud of Turin. And if you'd like to learn more about me or otherwise, go to guypowell.com. And I didn't. Do you have a website, Doug? By the way?
Oh yeah, DougPowell.com.
Yeah, so Guy Powell and DougPowell.com. Very easy to remember. So thank you again, Doug, and we'll be talking, I'm sure.
Great. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.